Okay, good evening, everybody. It is time for some more reading. In fact, I'm starting a little bit late tonight, about 15 minutes late, but that's okay. We are up to chapters 8 and 9 of The Secret History of the World, so let's just dive right on in. Like all the other chapter titles, this one is bullet pointed, covering all the subjects that will be in this chapter. So this one is chapter 8, the Sphinx and the Time Lock Orpheus, Daedalus, the first scientist, Job, and solving the riddle of the Sphinx. When Jason set off on the Argus on what proved to be the last hurrah of the demigods and heroes, his boat contained many of the great figures of the age, including Hercules and Theseus. But among these muscle-bound superheroes, there was one with very different powers, a transitional figure who looked forward to life after the demigods and heroes had left, when humans would have to fend for themselves. Orpheus had traveled down from the north, bringing with him the gift of music. His music was so beautiful that it could not only charm humans and animals, it could make trees, even rocks, move. On the voyage with Jason, he helped the heroes when brute force could not. Singing and accompanying himself on his lyre, he charmed the great clashing rocks that threatened to crash the Argus, and he sent the dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece to sleep. On his return, he fell in love with Eurydice. I guess that's how you pronounce that. But on the day of their wedding, she was bitten on the ankle by a snake and died. Half blinded by grief, Orpheus descended into the underworld. He was determined not to accept the new order of life and death, determined to win her back. Death was now a terrible thing, no longer a welcome rest when the spirit recuperated and refreshed itself in preparation for its next incarnation. It was a painful separation from those you love. Descending deeper and deeper, Orpheus encountered the grim old ferryman Charon. Am I saying that right? Yeah, whatever. Who at first refused to row him across the river Styx to the land of the dead, but Charon was charmed by the lyre, as was Cerberus, the three-headed dog whose job was to guard the way to the underworld. Orpheus charmed, too, the terrible demons whose task was to tear from the spirits of the dead the unregenerated animal lusts and savage desires that still clung to them. Finally, he reached the place where the king of the underworld held his love captive. The king was not unequivocally charmed by Orpheus because the release he granted was not unconditional. There was just one small condition. Eurydice could return to the world of the living if Orpheus could lead her up there without ever once turning around to make sure she was following. But of course, Orpheus, at the last moment, as the sunlight hit his face, perhaps worried he was being tricked by the king, did turn around. He saw the love of his life suddenly pulled back down away from him, down the stone passages, out of sight, fading into the underworld like a wisp of smoke. The other, more muscle-bound heroes had succeeded in their quest by fighting the good fight to the limits of their strength and endurance, by being brave and never giving up. But times were changing. The great initiates who preserved this story for us wanted us to understand that Orpheus failed because he tried to do what every good hero had done. He tried to make sure. It may also be that his music lost some of its charm because it did not stop a band of Maenads, the female followers of Dionysus, throwing themselves upon him and tearing him limb from bloody limb. They threw his head into the river, and it floated downstream, still singing. As it floated by, the weeping willows crowded the banks. Finally, the head of Orpheus was rescued and set on an altar in a cave, where crowds came to consult it as an oracle. Interesting. Okay. If Cadmus/Enoch named the planets and the stars, it was Orpheus who measured them, and by measuring them invented numbers. There were 8 notes in an octave, but in a sense really only 7, as the eighth always represents elevation to the next octave. The octaves then refer to ascent through the 7 spheres of the solar system, which in antiquity were central to all thought and experience. By giving a system of notation, Orpheus was originating mathematics. Concepts could be manipulated, paving the way for the scientific understanding of the physical universe. Orpheus is a transitional figure because, on the one hand, he is a magician with the power to move stones with music, but on the other, he is a forerunner of science. Later, we will see a similar ambiguity in many great scientists, even in modern times, but the other representative of the transition taking place at the time of Orpheus was Daedalus. We know he was a contemporary because he was the keeper of the Minotaur, killed by Theseus, who joined in the quest for the Golden Fleece. Daedalus is famous for making wings out of wax and feathers to help him and his son Icarus to escape from Crete. He also designed the labyrinth and is credited with inventing the saw and the sail. So he was an inventor, an engineer, an architect in ways we would recognize today. He did not use magic. If science was an innovation of the age, so too was magic. Magic was the application of a scientific way of thinking to the supernatural. In this age, we no longer see the seemingly effortless shape-shiftings of earlier ages or the turning of those who have offended into spiders, stags, or plants. Instead, we see Jason's wife Medea and Circe, to whom Medea went for help, advice, and magical protection. Circe and Medea had to work in order to achieve their supernatural effects, using potions, spells, incantations. If the invention of words and numbers enabled humans to begin to manipulate the natural world, it also gave them the idea of being able to manipulate the spirit world. Medea offered Jason a blood-red potion made from the juice of the crocus to soothe the dragon that guarded the fleece. She used chants and sprigs of juniper to spray the dragon's eyelids. She dealt in magic elixirs and knew the secrets of the snake charmer. As the material world continued to become denser and as the beings of the spirit worlds were increasingly squeezed out, even the lowest level of spirits, the nature spirits, the sylphs, dryads, naiads, and gnomes, became elusive. They seemed to disappear into the streams, trees, and rocks, fleeing the first light of dawn, but they still seemed tantalizingly close, and it was these spirits then as now that magicians found easier to manipulate. Some magicians tried to bend the great gods to their will, too, to draw them down from the moon. The myths of the original werewolf, like it's not lichen, it's Lycaon, Lycaon, who prompted the flood of Deucalion, of Poseidon's flooding of the Thracian plain, causing Athena to move her city to the present site of Athens, and the terrible storms that pursued Medea wherever she went are depictions of the environmental catastrophes that are resulting from the practice of black magic. That were resulting from the practice of black magic. Okay. Oh, and we are in an ad. So, time to pause. I don't know who sees these and who doesn't, but I'll just hold off. It said we were going into an ad, and this time it actually did it. Go figure. Doesn't always. Okay. All right. A few more seconds. No worries. We're not in a big hurry here, right? Okay, so we should be back. Um, so there was only one final line and then a picture to show. At the end of this period, humanity is sick, and so too is nature. Okay, so let me show you this picture. It says magicians drawing down the moon, Greek drawing. Okay, so there we have magicians drawing down the moon, which happens to be the name of a um, book by Margot Adler, which is I have but have never read. Is was anyway a very well-known book on Wicca. I have not read it though. It is, as I recall, more aimed at women, but that doesn't mean I can't read it. So I'll get to it. Orpheus might have failed by the standards of the conventional hero, but his influence on history was greater and more long-lasting, than that of Hercules, Theseus, and Jason. The music Orpheus originated could be a balm for healing the sick and troubled spirit of humanity down the millennia. If people were becoming isolated not only from the gods but from one another, if they were worn down by an always harsh and sometimes hostile environment, and if their imaginations were infected by the perverse and bestial impulses of magic, all of this would now be countered by the aesthetic influence on the imagination, not only through music but also literature, painting, and sculpture. Inspiring images of beauty, truth, and love worked on humanity at a level below that of the conscious mind. They were more powerful than any explicit abstract moral teaching. Orpheus was the mystical founder of the Greek mysteries that would light up and inspire ancient Greece. Perhaps the most powerful artistic expression of the spiritual crisis at the end of the age of the heroes comes in the Bible. In the written form, it has come down to us. The story of Job is one of the later texts of the Old Testament, but in its origins, it is one of the oldest parts. Job was a good man, yet he lost all his money. His sons and daughters died. Left all alone, he was covered with a plague of boils. Meanwhile, the wicked prospered. The story of Job has come down to us not because he was a great leader or doer of great deeds, but because he was the first human being ever to think a very important and deeply true thought: life is unfair. Hercules had been the sport of the gods, but it was Job who cried out to the heavens in defiance. Unlike Hercules, Job had the language to do so. Today, we take it for granted that we have enough mental maneuverability to choose what to think about. However, before the invention of language, which was the great achievement of this age, this maneuverability would not have been possible. Language enables us to distance ourselves from the world. It helps us to withdraw from what is physically present and can enable us to break down experience, whether present or not, into bits we can manipulate. To some degree, we can put experience into order as we wish. There is an alienating element to this process, as well as the advantages it brought. Language made the world a colder, darker, and trickier place. We saw earlier how thinking is itself a deadening process. Language, too, makes us unhealthy, less vividly alive, and less sure-footed in our wanderings in the world. So the language brought with it a new form of consciousness. Before Job, people felt that everything that happened to them was meant to happen to them. that there was a divine purpose behind everything they could not question. Now language enabled Job to step back. He began to notice inconsistencies. Life is unfair. Blake's Job. Oh, I guess that's the caption for this picture that I'm going to show you. Blake's Job is the whole caption. So here we go. So I would assume that this is Job in the center. Um, and are these supposed to be angels above him, I think? All these four figures up here. There's... Is this like an angel and a demon? An angel with four horses and a demon with... I can only see two. Maybe there's more there, but two snakes. And then would these be his ancestors, I would guess? I'm not sure. It's a very interesting drawing. Okay, but God rebuked Job for understanding so little. Quote, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Have you entered the springs of the sea or walked the depths of the deep? Have the gates of death been opened to you? Do you know where the sun lives and where the darkness comes from? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion?" End quote. What saved Joe was that he had that sense we all have when we awake from a wonderful dream, when we try to bring it back but cannot. We are aware that the range of human experience was in some way diminishing. Quote, "Oh, that I was as in the times of old, when God watched over me, when his lamp shone on my head." End quote. Job 29, 2 through 4. Job refers, of course, to the lantern of Osiris. Today, the word apocryphal carries pejorative associations, but really it means hidden or esoteric. In the apocryphal testament of Job, he was rewarded for being conscious of what he did not know, conscious of what he had lost. Job's sons and daughters were returned to him, his daughters wearing golden girdles. One belt gave Job the ability to understand the language of the angels, the second the secrets of creation, and the third the language of the cherubim. Music, mathematics, and language were invented in the age of the heroes, and so too was astronomy, another achievement attributed to Enoch. The first stone circles not only marked out the dispositions of the hierarchies of the gods and angels, they marked out the positions of the stars and planets. In the secret history, therefore, it also now becomes possible for the first time to begin to fix the dates of great events. Between the lion paws of the Sphinx at Giza, gazing eastwards, is a large stone that carries the inscription, quote, "This is the splendid place of the first time." End quote. The mysterious first time, or Zeptepi, was a phrase the Egyptians used to allude to the beginning of time. In their mythology, Zeptepi was marked by the rising of the primordial mound out of the waters and the alighting on it of the phoenix. By a remarkable feat of reconstruction which he made while standing between the paws of the Sphinx, Robert Bovell has managed to determine the date of Zeptepi in Egyptian mythology. I'm sorry, of Zeptepi. In Egyptian mythology, the phoenix arrived to mark the beginning of a new age. In Egyptian mythology, the phoenix, or Bennu bird, is the symbol of the Sothic cycle of 100, I'm sorry, I said 100, 1460 years, which is the time it took the Egyptians' 365-day calendar to resynchronize with the beginning of the yearly cycle, marked by the heliacal rising of Sirius. The synchronization of these two cycles, the yearly and the Sothic, took place in 11,451, 10,081, 7,160, 4,241, and 2781 BC. Bovell noticed immediately that these dates coincided with the commencement of some of the great building projects up and down the Nile. Nearly the starting Clearly, the starting of this cycle was very important to the ancient Egyptians. Trying to figure out which cycle might have been the first one, he was initially attracted by the idea that it might be 10,081 BC because of an esoteric tradition that the Sphinx had been built at this time or even earlier. Then Bovell worked out that on the earlier date of 11,451 BC, the Milky Way, which had immense significance in ancient cultures around the world, as the River of Souls, was lying directly over the course of the Nile, so that they mirrored each other. Moreover, it also struck him that on this very early date of 11,451, the Sothic and yearly cycles coincided with a third cycle, the Great Year, the 25,920-year-long complete cycle of the zodiac, in a most meaningful way. Because on that day, the lion-bodied Sphinx's eastwards gaze would have taken in the dawning of the age of Leo. The Sphinx embodies the four cardinal constellations of the zodiac, the four corners of the cosmos: Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aquarius, the four elements that work together to make the material world. The Sphinx, according to the secret history, is a monument to the first time the four elements locked into place and matter finally became solid. When in the Timaeus, Plato famously wrote of the world soul being crucified on the world body, he was not prophesying the crucifixion of Christ, as some Christian apologists have supposed. He was recalling this crucial moment in world history as idealism conceives it, when consciousness was finally fixed in solid matter. The Sphinx, therefore, was a very special place has a very special place in history as idealism tells it. It works. Wow, I'm screwing up all over the place. Hey, Vesper, how you doing? Good to have you come in. Thank you. The Sphinx, therefore, has a very special place in history as idealism tells it. It marks that point when, after wave upon wave of emanations from the cosmic mind, solid matter as we know it today was finally formed. That is why it is perhaps the greatest icon of the ancient world. The laws of physics, as we know them today, were only then set in motion, and from that point on the dates can be firmly fixed, because the great clock of the cosmos was finally set in its complex pattern of orbits. You're doing good, good, good. Glad to hear it. Hope you had a good holiday. If you celebrate holidays, I don't know. Um, Not everybody does. Complex pattern of orbits. If this late solidification of matter were what actually happened, it would, of course, invalidate dating methods such as carbon-14, conventionally used to try to establish early chronologies. Modern science makes an assumption in its calculations that the ancients did not, namely that the natural laws have held true in all places and at all times. You partake in the Thanksgiving, as do I, and it was an okay one. Spent more time working on a vehicle than I did vacationing, but that's okay. It needed to be done. All right. The Sphinx asks Oedipus a riddle. What walks on four legs, then two legs, then three legs? If he cannot answer it, the Sphinx will kill him, but he correctly interprets it as a riddle concerning the ages of man. A baby walks on four legs, grows up to walk on two legs, until so old that a third leg or walking stick is needed. But ages here is also another way of evoking the evolution of humanity. The form of the Sphinx is a monument to this evolution. The Sphinx is defeated by the acumen of Oedipus and casts itself into the precipice or abyss. The Sphinx's dying is a way of showing that the gods of the elements, these organizing principles of the universe, became successfully absorbed inside the human body at this time. Central to the Oedipal legend is the terrible fate he hoped, but failed to avoid. He duly kills his father and becomes his mother's lover, as the laws of nature become fixed and mechanical, humans are trapped in them. So the Sphinx also marks the end of the age of metamorphosis, the fixing of the biological forms we know today. It also bars the way back. In Genesis, it is one of the cherubim who bars the way back into Eden, and the Egyptians called the Sphinx made up of four cherubim, hu, hu, meaning protector. By this, they meant that he guarded against any slide back into the old ways of procreation. It's a common misconception that in 1650, when Bishop Ussher famously calculated the date of the creation as humankind as 4004 BC, this was some last vestige of an ancient superstition. In fact, Ussher's calculation was the product of a time when materialism was gaining ground, and so too was a narrow, literal interpretation of the Bible that would have seemed absurd to the ancients. They believed that human souls had existed for vast, immeasurable eras before 11,451 BC, and only then did the human body as we know it today fully materialize around the human spirit. It is interesting to note that according to the calculations of Manetho, I've never seen that name before, in the 3rd century BC, this is almost exactly the time when the reign of the demigods came to an end. We will see later that according to esoteric doctrine, not only was matter only precipitated out of mind a short while ago, but that it exists only for a brief interval. It will dissolve again in just over 9,000 years when the sun rises again to meet the gaze of the Sphinx in the constellation of Leo. In the teachings of the secret societies, we live on a small island of matter in a vast ocean of ideas and imagination. Okay, and then we have a picture. The Sphinx, this is the caption, the Sphinx which showed the four elements locked into place at the four cardinal points. In modern times, the eminent Egyptologist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz, protege of Henri Matisse, was the first to reveal to a wider public that the Sphinx might have been carved before 10,000 BC. He pointed to the fact that the walls surrounding the monument show signs of water erosion that could not have been made after that time. The Sphinx, according to the secret history, is a monument to the first time the four elements locked into place and matter finally became solid. In 11,451 BC, east, west, north, and south were then locked with the four elements that make up the physical world. And then we have the picture, and it's not a very good quality picture, but I'll show it to you anyway. So I think if this was clearer, this would be Schwaller de Leibniz. Schwaller de Lubitz, I'm sorry. All right. I'm going to go refill my water real quick, and then I'll come back and read chapter 9, which is the Neolithic Alexander the Great, Noah and the Myth of Atlantis, Tibet, Rama's conquest of India, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So all those subjects will be covered in this chapter. So bear with me just a minute. I'll put us on the BVAC screen, and I'll just refill my water and be right back. Prepare to die. Okay, let's get back to it. So, getting into this 9th chapter. If you have a passing acquaintance with the myth of Atlantis, you may well have been left with the impression that there is only one ancient source for this legend, Plato. The Platonic account goes like this. Egyptian priests told Solon, a statesman and lawyer of the generation of Plato's great-grandfather, about a great island in the Atlantic that had been destroyed some 9,000 years earlier, in about 9600 BC. The civilization on this island had been founded by the god Poseidon and peopled by the descendants of his coupling with a beautiful woman called Cleito. Cleito? Whatever. Um, as we saw in Chapter 5, this intervention by a fish god is a coded account of evolution, common to mythologies all around the world. As well as the main island, this Atlantean civilization also ruled over several lesser islands in the region. The largest island was dominated by a beautiful and fertile plain and a large hill. Here, Cleito lived, and the people enjoyed food which grew abundantly on the island. Two streams of water came up through the earth, one of hot water and one of cold. To keep Cleito for himself, Poseidon had a series of circular canals dug around the hill. In time, a sophisticated civilization grew up, taming wild animals, mining metals, and building temples, palaces, race courses, gymnasiums, public baths, government buildings, harbors, and bridges. Many walls were coated with metals, with brass, tin, and a red metal unknown to us called orichalcum. The temples had roofs of ivory and pinnacles of silver and gold. The islands of Atlantis were ruled over by 10 kings, each with his own kingdom, the 9 others being subservient to the ruler of the largest island. The central temple, dedicated to Poseidon, had statues of gold, including one of the gods standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses and flanked by hundreds of uh, Nereids riding dolphins. Live bulls roamed freely around the forest of columns in this temple, and every 5 or 6 years the 10 kings who ruled the islands between them were left alone in the temple to hunt these bulls without weapons. They would capture one, lead it up to the great column of orichalcum, inscribed with laws of Atlantis, and there behead it. Life on the islands of Atlantis was generally idyllic. In fact, life was so good that eventually people could not bear it any longer and began to become restless, decadent, and corrupt, searching for novelty and power. So Zeus decided to punish them. The islands were flooded until only small islets remained, like a skeleton sticking out of the sea. Then finally a great earthquake engulfed all that was left in the course of one day and one night. Yes, it would make this account of the destruction of Atlantis unlikely to be true if Plato were the only classical writer on the subject. Aristotle said of it, quote, Plato alone made Atlantis rise out of the sea, and then he submerged it again, end quote, which has been taken to mean that Plato simply made the whole thing up. However, a little research shows that classical literature is packed with references to Atlantis. For example, in the works of Proclus, Diodorus, Pliny, Strabo, Plutarch, and Posidonius, and they include many elements which are not in Plato and seem to come from earlier sources, assuming, that is, that they haven't been made up too. Proclus says that 300 years after Solon, Crantor was shown columns by the priest of Sais covered with a history of Atlantis in hieroglyphic characters. A near contemporary of Plato's, now known as Pseudo-Aristotle, wrote about a similar island paradise in his book On Marvelous Things Heard. The great historian Marcellus, also a near contemporary of Plato's, is clearly relying on ancient sources when he writes that, quote, in the outer ocean, the Atlantic, there are 7 small islands and 3 larger ones, one of which was dedicated to Poseidon, end quote. This ties in with Plato's account in terms of the number of kingdoms. A Greek historian of the 4th century BC, Theopompus of Chios, retells a story told 200 years before Plato by Midas of Phrygia, that, quote, besides the well-known portions of the world, Europe, Asia, Libya, or Africa, there is another which is unknown, of incredible immensity, where vast blooming meadows and pastures feed herds of various huge and mighty beasts, and where the men are twice the height and live to twice the age of men, end quote. As we have already seen, Enoch and the myths of the legends of many cultures around the world recorded the prevalence of giants before the Great Flood. Then, of course, there is the Greek myth of the Great Flood, the story of Deucalion, is much older than Plato. As in both Plato's account and the biblical one, there is an implication here that the Great Flood was intended to destroy the greater part of humankind, because the development of humankind had gone wrong. Rudolf Steiner has pointed out that the stories of the demigods and heroes, Cadmus, Theseus, Jason, all involve journeys eastward. We should read them, he says, as stories of migrations which took place as conditions on the Atlantean islands deteriorated and before the final catastrophe. When Plato writes about Poseidon, the first god king of Atlantis, this should remind us of what we saw in Chapter 5, that Poseidon was the original half-fish form of Zeus/Jupiter. Poseidon was also god of the raging sea, god of subterranean volcanic depths, whose bull-bellowing roar signaled climatic catastrophe. Poseidon was at work at both the beginning and the end of Atlantis' history. Other ancient cultures cross-reference Plato's account. The South American Aztecs recorded that they came from Aztlan, the land in the middle of the water. Sometimes this land was called Aztlan of the Seven Caves. It was depicted as a central, large step pyramid surrounded by 6 smaller pyramids. According to traditions collected by the invading Spaniards, humanity had nearly been wiped out by a vast flood and would have been but for a priest and his wife who constructed a boat made out of a hollow log, in which they also rescued seeds and animals. The complex and sophisticated astronomy of these South American tribes has allowed one modern researcher to deduce that they dated this flood to about 11,600 BC. This might seem a long way from Plato's date of around 9600 BC, but the crucial point here is that both dates agree in setting the flood at the end of the Ice Age. Modern geology tells us that as the ice caps melted, a series of floods swept down from the north. We have already noted the suggestion that the islands of Atlantis suffered several catastrophic floods over a long period before the last island was finally completely submerged. Underwater archaeologists are today discovering in many parts of the world the remains of civilizations which were covered by floods caused by the melting of ice at the end of the Ice Age. In April 2002, diverse stories told by local fishermen were used to help locate the lost city of the 7 pagodas off the coast of Mahabalipuram in India. The temple-like structures that have been found are much grander and more complex than we would expect for the end of the Ice Age, the Neolithic or New Stone Age. Author and investigator Graham Hancock, who has done so much to question our academic assumptions about ancient history, was quoted at the time as saying, quote, "I have argued for many years that the world's flood myths deserve to be taken seriously, a view that most Western academics reject. But here at Mahabalipuram, we have proved the myths right and the academics wrong." End quote. I myself have seen artifacts retrieved from the seabed off the American Atlantic coast, the so-called Scott stones, which I am persuaded it would be very difficult for technology to reproduce today, let alone 11,000 years ago when this area in question went under the sea. Excuse me. In design terms, the Scott stones show features which are remarkably similar to Egyptian artifacts. This is not my secret to reveal, but I hope that perhaps by the time this book is published, Aaron Duvall, president of the Miami Museum Egyptological Society, may have chosen to show the world what he has. No detailed description of the events that put such artifacts under the sea has survived in the Greek myths that have come down to us, and the biblical account is characteristically brief, but these can be supplemented and illumined by accounts from other cultures, particularly the Sumerian and other Near Eastern accounts. No scholars dispute that some of these accounts from older cultures provided source material for the biblical story. Elements familiar to us from the biblical account, such as the ark, the doves, and the olive branch, appeared in the earlier Sumerian account, where Noah is called Ziasudra. He appears too in the Mesopotamian account, where he is called Atrahasis. I'm not sure. And in the Babylonian account, which names him Upnapishtim. Weaving these different versions together creates an amplified version of the biblical story. And he has the story written out here, so it's a very long quote. One day Noah was standing in a reed hut when he heard a voice coming through the wall that warned him of a rainstorm that would wipe out mankind. Tear down your reed hut and build a boat, he was told. Noah and his family set about building a great vessel made out of reeds, finally daubing it with bitumen in order to make it watertight. Everything growing out of the ground, everything grazing on it, the birds in the sky, the cattle, and the wild animals roaming open country, he put in. Then for 6 days and nights the storm blew, and their boat was tossed about by the waves. The downpour, the storm, and the flood overwhelmed the surface of the earth. On the seventh day, hearing the winds begin to fall, Noah opened a window and light fell on his face. The world was silent because all humanity had been returned to clay. And that's the end of the story. The catastrophic deluge that nearly destroyed humankind is remembered every year by both the living and the dead on the Day of the Dead or Halloween. In England, as late as the 19th century, villagers would dress up as the dead, wear masks, and make a mumming sound that with closed lips to imitate the sound made by the walking dead, hence the word mummers. Okay, odd. Um, there is a little picture here I'll show, but there's no caption for it, so I'll wait until the next picture, which is on the very next page, and then I'll show both pictures. When Noah and his family disembarked to set foot on dry land, something rather odd happened. Quote, and Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham saw the nakedness of father, and told his two brethren without. End quote. And that is Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. It is entirely fitting that Noah should become a husbandman because archaeology tells us that agriculture began during this period, the Neolithic. But what we are but what are we to make of the strange story of his drunken nakedness? In order to make sense of it, we must turn to the tradition that identifies Noah with the legendary Greek figure Dionysus the Younger. We need to disentangle two different strands of stories concerning two figures with the same name. Dionysus is the name of two distinct individuals, a god and later a demigod. These two make very different contributions to human history in two different eras. The Dionysus who should be identified with Noah is very different from the earlier Dionysus, Zagreus, the older Dionysus, the story of whose dismemberment we told in chapter 6. After the flood, Dionysus the Younger, often depicted in a boat, traveled from Atlantis via Europe to India with the aim of teaching the whole world the arts of agriculture, the sowing of crops, the cultivation of the vine, and writing. This later had of course been taught by Enoch, but was now in danger of being lost in the devastation brought by the flood. Dionysus and his followers carried the thyrsus, a pole wrapped with ivy-like snakes and topped with a pine cone like a pineal gland. This shows that Dionysus also taught the secret evolution of the human form, the development of the spine topped by the pineal gland we have just been considering. The fauns and satyrs of the whole route of Dionysus represent stragglers from Atlantis. They are the last remnant of a process of metamorphosis of forms. The curious story in Genesis of Noah's sons uncovering his genitals while he was drunkenly sleeping also refers to the petering out of this process. We saw that the genitals were the last parts of human anatomy to evolve into their present form, and his sons were curious to find out about their origins. Were they the sons of a human or a demigod, a man or an angel? Okay, so now we've got the caption for this picture, and then I'll go back and show you that other one. Noah's Ark, legend has it that the only animal that missed the ark was the unicorn, which therefore became extinct. This is an obvious depiction of the diminishing of the powers of the third eye. As the waters of the deluge closed over Atlantis, the era of imagination ended. The subconscious was formed. Okay, so let me show you that picture. This is supposed to be a picture of the ark, which is a very square, angular thing. I've seen it depicted similarly, though. Um, and then, where's this other picture? Will it show up? Yeah. There's not much to it, but I show all pictures. I think this is referring back to the masks that the mummers were wearing. So there you have it. That's all it is. There was no caption to go with it. All right. And then we have immediately on the next page, we have another picture. So this is Dionysus the Younger was educated by the satyr Silenus. And there you have it. With his fig leaf, holding the kid. Some kind of a pillar behind him with leaves and stuff. Okay. Stories about this individual in the Greek and Hebrew traditions, Dionysus the Younger and Noah, are both connected with the grape and intoxication. We have already met followers of Dionysus. The wild and savage Maenads tore Orpheus limb from limb with tooth and nail. In a state of ecstatic drunkenness, the Maenads were possessed by a god. Primitive peoples have always lived in tune. Oh, he's totally changing gears here. Primitive peoples have always lived in tune with the vegetable part of their natures. One of the results is that they have understood how different plants have different effects on human biology, physiology, and consciousness. What we see in these Greek and Hebrew traditions at the beginning of agriculture is a depiction of a new, more thoughtful form of consciousness. What greater outward symbol of the impact of orderly human thought on nature could there be than fields of wheat? The task of the leaders of humanity would now be to forge the new thought-directed consciousness. In the Zend Avesta, the sacred literature of Zoroastrianism, the Noah/Dionysus figure is called Yima. He tells the people how to build a settlement, a var, a fenced-in place, a kind of stronghold, quote, taking in men, cattle, dogs, birds, and blazing fires, end quote. He instructs people that when they arrive at the place where they are to settle, they must, quote, drain off water, put up boundary posts, then make houses from posts, clay walls, matting, and fences, end quote. He urges his people to expand the earth by tilling it, quote unquote. There was to be neither suppression nor baseness, neither dullness nor violence, neither poverty nor defeat, no cripples, no long teeth, no giants, neither any of the characteristics of the evil spirit, which was another quote, and I forgot to say that. And we have yet another picture. The invasion of Ceylon by Rama, the shepherds. The invasion of Ceylon by Rama, the shepherds of the people. Shepherd of the people. Okay. So the invasion. I don't know if you could see that better. It, not sure that it really helps to blow it up that much. Okay. Again, we see an anxiety about a reversion to anomalous forms of the previous epoch, such as giants. The Greek epic poet Nonnus described Dionysus's migration to India, and the same journey is also described by the Zendavesta as, quote, the march of the ram on India, end quote. But the fullest description comes in the great Indian epic, the Ramayana. And just quickly, I had a thought. If you're interested in reading the Zendavesta and other writings from Zoroastrianism, which I've read bits and pieces of over the years, they are very interesting. They are one of the first monotheistic religions, and a lot of that stuff is available on sacredtext.com, sacred-texts.com. No affiliation with them. I just think it's a really cool website. Anyway, moving on. Something that is clear from these accounts is that the great migrations eastwards were not moving into uninhabited territories. While the peoples of Atlantis had been all but eliminated, the emigrants traveled to new lands still occupied by aboriginal tribes. We see Dionysus's reaction to what he found in these new lands in his forbidding of cannibalism and human sacrifice. Native priests would sometimes keep enormous snakes or pterodactyls, rare survivors from the antediluvian times, which were worshipped as gods and fed the flesh of captives. The Ramayana describes how Rama and his followers suddenly invaded these temples with torches, driving out both priests and monsters. He would appear without warning among enemies, sometimes with bow drawn, sometimes defenseless, except that he was able to petrify them with his pale, lotus blue gaze. Rama was dispossessed, a nomad. His kingdom lay beneath the seas. He did not live the life of a king, but camped out in the wild with his beloved Sita. Then Sita was abducted by the evil magician Ravana. The Ramayana tells of the completion of Rama's journey with the conquest of India and the taking of Ceylon, the last refuge of Ravana. Rama formed a bridge over the sea between mainland India and Ceylon with the help of an army of monkeys, which is to say hominids, the descendants of human spirits who had rushed into incarnation too early and were doomed to die out. Finally, after a battle that lasted 13 days, Rama killed Ravana by showering fire down on him. We might see Rama as a Neolithic Alexander the Great. Following the conquest of India, he had the world at his feet. He also had a dream. He was walking in the forests on a moonlit night when a beautiful woman came towards him. Her skin was as white as snow, and she was wearing a magnificent crown. He did not recognize her at first, but then she said, quote, I am Sita. Take this crown and rule the world with me. End quote. She knelt humbly and offered him a glittering crown, the kingship which had been denied him. But just then his guardian angel whispered in his ear, quote, if you place the crown on your head, you will see me no more, and if you clasp that woman in your arms, she will experience such happiness that it will kill her instantly. But if you refuse to love her, she will live out the rest of her life free and happy on earth, and your invisible spirit will rule over her. End quote. As Rama made up his mind, Sita disappeared among the trees. They would never see each other again, leading the remainder of their lives apart. Stories about Sita's later life suggest it was by no means obvious that she was as happy as the guardian angel had promised. In its ambiguity and uncertainty, there is something very modern about this story. We can also see in it a paradox that lies at the heart of the human condition. All love, if it is true love, involves a letting go. With his prowess with the bow, his handsome face, blue eyes, and lion chest, Rama is in many ways like the heroes that Greek myths describe, such as Hercules. But in the story of Rama, there is, as I say, something new. Hercules was required to choose between virtue and happiness, and unsurprisingly chose the former. Rama's story, on the other hand, contains an element of moral surprise. The reader of the story will probably agree with Sita as she argues that with Rama that it is only right and fitting that he now accept the crown he has been cheated of since birth. But then Rama's surprising choices, deciding not to take the crown that is rightfully his, not to marry the woman he loves, these dilate the moral imagination and quicken the moral intelligence. The story of Rama encourages us to see beyond the conventional, to imagine ourselves into the world of others, and also ultimately to think for ourselves. Esoteric thinking has always sought to undermine and subvert conventional, habitual, mechanical modes of thought. Later we will see how the storytellers, dramatists, and novelists steeped in esoteric thought, from Shakespeare and Cervantes to George Eliot and Tolstoy, would quicken the moral imagination, one of the distinguishing characteristics of the very greatest literature. If great art and literature give a sense of patterns of laws operating beyond conventional thought, great esoteric art brings these laws near to the surface of consciousness. The story of Rama also brings us back to the notion that according to the secret history, the cosmos has been formed in order to create the conditions in which people could experience free thought and free will. Rama could have enforced what is good and right on his people by ruling them with a rod of iron, but he instead let them decide for themselves. Rama is thus the archetype of the exiled or secret king or secret philosopher who influences the course of history not from the throne but by mingling incognito among the people. Rama tried to help humans to evolve freely. Rama is a demigod but declines to be the ruler of the world. No longer will gods or even demigods sit on thrones in bodies of flesh and bone. At journey's end, the emigrants founded Shambhala, a great spiritual fortress in the mountainous region of Tibet, the roof of the world. Tibet is the world's biggest, highest plateau, surrounded by high mountain ranges. Some traditions say the Tibetan population is directly descended from the people of Atlantis. Some say that Shambhala can only be reached via an underground tunnel, others that it exists in another dimension into which a secret portal opens somewhere in the region. St. Augustine was the greatest Christian theologian after St. Paul, and, like St. Paul, was an initiate of a mystery school. He wrote about the place where Enoch and the saints lived, a terrestrial paradise so high up that the flood could not reach it. Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swedish theologian, diplomat, and inventor, and also the leading esoteric Freemason of the age, wrote that, quote, "The lost world must be sought among the sages of Tibet and Tartary." End quote. Anne Catherine Emmerich, the 19th century German Catholic mystic, wrote similarly of a Mount of Prophets where live Enoch, Elijah, and others who did not die in the ordinary way but ascended, and where unicorns which survived the flood may also be found. From the mountain fastness of Tibet flowed streams of living spirituality which joined together, gathered force, depth, and width, and became a mighty river like the Ganges, feeding the whole of India. In this history of the world written in the stars, the next era began as the sun began to rise in the constellation of Cancer in 7227 BC, and the first great Indian civilization, the earliest and most deeply spiritual of post-flood civilizations, was founded. The founders felt little for the newly created material world, which they saw as Maya, an illusion, threatening to obscure the higher realities of the spirit worlds. They looked back with nostalgia to the time before this veil of matter had been drawn between humankind and the spiritual hierarchies. The icy baths and other forms of self-torture of the ascetics can be looked on as part of the effort to stay awake to the spirit worlds. A conscious effort was made by them while the veil was still relatively translucent to remember the lineaments of the spirit world and the and to impress them indelibly on human consciousness. The success of this enterprise has meant that India is still the world's greatest storehouse of spiritual knowledge, particularly as regards occult physiology. As a high-level initiate recently said to me, quote, "If you visit India today, you cannot help feeling how the air still just crackles with astra- astrality." End quote. Great Western teachers such as Pythagoras, Apollonius of Tyana, and Saint Germain have traveled to India in search of this astrality. The Gospels contain quotes from older Indian sources and more ideas that originated there. Sir John Woodruff, the Sanskrit scholar who first translated the Tantric texts in the 19th century, has written how even the venerable Sufi tradition leant on Hindu wisdom for teachings on the chakras, for example. In the 1960s onwards, Indian religion was felt by many people in the West to offer a working spiritual knowledge, including practical spiritual disciplines and guides through the spirit worlds which they could not find in church. A bookshop in the West is still likely to stock more books on mysticism derived from the Eastern than from the Western tradition. That's true. Following Rama's refusal to take the crown, no great single personality dominates this period. If Rama was an all-action hero who fought monsters, went on long, dangerous adventures, and founded cities, his successors, sometimes called the Seven Wise Ones, or the Rishis, had a stillness and inactivity about them. They built no stone buildings. They lived in buildings of mud or simple shelters twisted into shape from roots and tendrils. Nothing of the rishis has lasted except what they knew. There is a simple saying in the Kabbalah, quote, "Everything you have seen, every flower, every bird, every rock will pass away and turn to dust, but that you have seen them will not pass away." End quote. This is a saying that would have seemed sympathetic to the rishis. Seated with legs folded so that the soles of their feet turn upwards, they have no desire to feel gravity, the downward, reductive pull of the material world, but headed instead for the spirit worlds. They were able to see spiritual beings at work on the earth, how they help seeds to germinate in spring, flowers to bloom in summer, trees to bear fruit in autumn, and how seeds are preserved through winter by these same spiritual beings. The rishis experienced the ebb and flow of spiritual influence like a giant breath. Ancient Indian civilization was like the lowest realm of heaven. Earlier, we talked about the way materialists misappropriate words and phrases, such as the meaning of life, using them in a secondary and slightly dishonest sense. The same is true of spiritual, often used by people to puff themselves as good-hearted or moral in the warm, fuzzy, perhaps pseudo-mystical way that is really what it really means is the ability to see, hear, and communicate with the spirits like the Indian adepts. They were also able to communicate in occult ways. Other people were felt by them to be sympathetic, or not by their breathing. By breathing in someone else's air, they could sense that person's inner life. Adepts are able to pour their knowledge into the souls of others in an unceasing flow of pictures. Much later, this knowledge would be put into words and passed from generation to generation orally until it was finally written down as the Vedas. Their gaze could drive away serpents and calm lions and tigers. Nothing could deflect the adepts from their contemplation. They wandered freely, building only the flimsiest shelters, eating fruit and drinking the milk of their flocks. They would eat only vegetable matter, never any meat. To do so, they believed, was to absorb the animal's death agony. And we are in an ad. So, I will wait to carry on. Death agony. Okay, there we are. So I know where we're at. We're almost done. We don't have that much more to go, but we'll wait for the ad to be done. 24 more seconds. Um, and then we can carry on. What is going on? Oh, okay. I'm looking at the ad, and it's something to do with the holidays. Um, anyway, we should be just about there. And it says we are back. Well, one thing says we're back, one thing doesn't. There we go. All right. So, picking up where we left off with animal death agony. Uh, they immerse themselves in vegetable consciousness, in the physical processes, waking, sleeping, breathing, digesting, which we have seen are the gift of the vegetable kingdom to the human body. By learning to control the en vegetalis, or etheric body, ens vegetalis, um, they could control too breathing, the rate of digestion, even heart rate, and the flow of blood, leading to the amazing feats for which Indian adepts are famous. The ability to stop the heart altogether just by thinking about it, for example. The adepts understood, too, how sinking deep into contemplation of the solar plexus chakra enabled them to perceive clairvoyantly, and they knew how to wrap others in a protective beam of love emanating from the heart chakra. In addition to the 16 petals of the heart chakra, the adepts saw 101 subtle and luminous arteries issuing from the same area like spokes from a wheel. 3 of these, larger ones, they saw rising to the head. One rises to the right eye and corresponds to the sun and the future. Another rises to the left eye and corresponds to the moon and the past. They understood how it was by a combination of these 2 organs that humans are enabled to perceive the movements of material objects in relation to one another in space, and so also to have a sense of time passing. The middle of the 3 arteries ran up from the heart and through the crown of the head. By this route, the way upwards is illumined from below by means of a radiant heart, and it was by the route of this middle artery, too, that the spirit would depart up through the crown and out of the body at death. Okay, and then we have a couple of pictures. So, yeah, okay. So the Neolithic swastika carved on a boulder on Cayley Moor in Yorkshire, England, is a symbol of the revolving 2-petaled lotus, and above the same device, in a Celtic sun brooch found in Sweden, the Rig Veda says, "Behold the beautiful splendor of Savitva, the sun god of the swastika, to inspire our visions." So, in case you didn't know, the swastika is many thousands of years old. Not a Nazi symbol. They took it and they corrupted it, but it's not originally a Nazi symbol. So, if you are offended by the swastika, get over it, because I'm going to show it. All right, so there we go. So this is the one, the first one he was talking about. And this is the one, a Celtic sun. Okay, that must have been the Celtic sun brooch, the first one, and then this other one is the one carved on the boulder in Yorkshire, England. I'll have to blow it up. There we go. So that is the one carved, and it is roughly a swastika. Okay, we're almost done with this chapter. To the ancients, all life was involved in a pulse, rhythm, or breath. They saw all human lives as breathed temporarily into the world of Maya or illusion, then breathed out again, a process repeated through the ages. They saw great flocks or shoals of souls being breathed in and out of material life together. This ancient Indian civilization was in some ways an echo of the sun-filled, watery vegetable world of the period before the sun and earth separated. In some ways, it too was a lotus-eating period that would have to end if progress was to take place. We saw how great beings from the higher hierarchies could no longer appear in physical bodies as they had earlier on Atlantis. They could still appear as semi-material specters or phantoms, but even this was happening less frequently. By the end of the age, people might only see them with their physical eyes once or twice in a lifetime. As the gods withdrew, people would have to find ways to follow them. In this way, yoga was born. At the height of their meditations, a rush of energy from the base of the spine would travel upwards through the middle artery via the heart to the head. Sometimes this energy was thought of being like a snake, which rose through the spine up into the skull and bit at a point just behind the bridge of the nose. This bite released an ecstatic, lace like flux of luminous currents, 700,000 lightning flares sounding like millions of bees. Um, this is Kundalini they're talking about. Adepts would find themselves in another dimension that appeared at first to consist of a mighty ocean of giant weaving waves of light and energy, the preliminary mystical experience in all traditions. As they became more accustomed to the spiritual world, these apparently impersonal forces would begin to resolve themselves into outer garments of the gods, and finally the faces of the gods themselves would emerge from the light. The same faces of the gods of stars and planets that have become familiar to us over the last few chapters. One of the shortest books in the world, but one of the most powerful, is called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It was written down in its final form in about 400 BC, but originated in the teachings of the rishis. Patanjali tells the reader to concentrate on the strength of the elephant, and by this means attain that strength. He says it is possible to know past lives by concentrating on the past. It would be wishful thinking to believe you or I might be able to perform these feats just like that. These are things that now, as then, only the most advanced, the highest initiates can attain. The rest of us will only be able to do them in future incarnations. The rishis taught that the evolution of the world cosmos, the rishis taught that the evolution of the whole cosmos is the goal of existence, and that the seeds of all the transformation lie in the human body. In 5067 BC, these gods were moving the cosmos toward the next stage of human evolution as the sun entered the sign of Gemini, just as earlier the impulse for the evolution of humankind had moved eastwards from drowning Atlantis to India. Now it began to move westwards as it continues to do today. And that is the end of the chapter. And what did you say? It said, I thought the Nazis invented it and all these people were still using it because they were evil. Nope, they did not invent it. Not at all. They stole it. It has been used by, um, it was been used in India. It was used in Greece. It was used by Native Americans. It was used by Buddhists. It's been around for thousands of years. Um, and as you can see, it was even used in England in Neolithic times. So, yeah, it's been around a very long time. They just decided to use it, and I think technically it's mirrored. They flipped it over, um, so the legs are pointing the different direction or something. It's kind of like using an inverted cross. The cross has been around forever, and certain groups use an inverted one to piss off Christians, pretty much. Um, but yeah, it's in the first Zelda game as a dungeon. Interesting, interesting. Um, have I ever played a Zelda game? I think I did way, way, way back. One of the early ones. I don't even remember which one it was. It was probably on around about the time. the Super Nintendo came out. So whatever one that one was. So, all right. So the next chapter that I'll pick up with next time is chapter 10. Um, and it is titled The Way of the Wizard Zarathustra's Battle Against the Powers of Darkness, The Life and Death of Krishna the Shepherd, and the Dawn of the Dark Age. So interesting. So we're going to get into the Bhagavad Gita, which is the story of Krishna, if I remember right. I might be wrong. It's been a long time since I read it. Um, but yeah. All right. Let's see who's around. Vesper, are you going to be streaming tonight? It's probably pretty late where you are. Um, so I would kind of assume not. Let's see. Taking a break tonight. Yeah. Don't blame you. You need to take breaks. You know what? Um, there's nobody on that I follow that's doing anything. So, I mean, Ren Flames and Alyosha, they're doing this constant stream thing. I don't know what they're doing. It just shows clips of their stuff. So I don't know. I don't know what their deal is right now. So I haven't been raiding them because there's nothing really to raid. They're not even there. So, and they're the only ones on right now. So I guess I'll just call it a night. So thank you for stopping in, Vesper. Always glad to have you. And I hope you enjoyed my stumbling through that couple of chapters. And I will see you either in my next stream or yours. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love.